Hello, and welcome to this latest installment of A Few Minutes With. And it is my great honor to have with me today the current master of Magdalene College in Cambridge and the author of nearly 50 books on everything from church history and liturgy to Dostoevsky and poetry. But most will know this gentleman as the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams. Dr. Williams, thank you so much for making time for this today.
Not a bit. Thank you for inviting me. Delighted to be with you.
Thank you. Well, at the outset, before we get into the conversation, I have to ask, how are you doing? And by you personally, you and your family, and the college, how are you doing during this time?
Well, it's a very strange time because, of course, none of the students are able to be in the college. We have to try and run the college virtually, and I'm doing far more online than I've ever done in my life before. And that's been very good for me. I've discovered I'm not quite as bad at on-screen technology as I thought I was.
The learning curve has been steep.
The learning curve. And also, there's a compensation. Our son is at home with us at the moment because his work in London was suspended. So he's come home to be with us, and that's very nice.
Wonderful, wonderful.
But it's a strange mixture of being very, very busy some of the time, and then random empty spaces in the diary.
Yes, yes. Well, I'd like to talk to you today about resurrection and how resurrection applies at various levels in the time in which we find ourselves. And I've talked to parishioners of my own, and I know many other clergy have as well, where even though we're in the Easter season and we know Christ is risen, emotionally and psychologically, there are many that are still stuck in that gap between Friday at the cross and Sunday morning at the empty tomb. And you've written that in some ways this is, when it comes to resurrection, the necessary first moment in that event of absence and loss. And you've also written that resurrection has to be shown as good news to Paul as the persecutor, and Peter as the betrayer, and Mary as the one that's grieving during this time. And so I'm curious what you think about how during this time the church, both clergy and laity, can remind people of the joy of the resurrection and some of the gifts that can be found in this initial moment.
Thank you. I think the first thing I'd want to say is that Jesus' resurrection isn't something about how we're feeling. It's not even something about a distant event in history. It's about something eternally true about God. Easter says that what God did in Jesus on earth, he is always doing through the risen Jesus. So the outreach of his hand to forgive, to heal, to call us into communion with one another, that is undefeatable. It goes on. And the resurrection states, among many other things, it certainly states, that is the God we believe in. So I may be feeling, it's not arrived, I don't know where I am, but the reality that is God continues, because it's not about whether I'm feeling gloomy or cheerful. Jesus rose from the dead nearly 2,000 years ago, and that, again, is not something which tells us, so the end of the world has arrived, there's nothing to do. It means that we now have a kind of door open into the reality of God and God's commitment and God's willingness to go on, as I say, doing what he did in Jesus, always. So that helps me a bit in these times, because, of course, it has felt the most unusual Easter imaginable. We haven't been able to go out there and be visible. And I was thinking about that in Holy Week this year, because in the parish I work in here, and in many others, of course, probably in yours too, it's a time when Christians are out on the streets a bit more. Processions of witness, Palm Sunday liturgies and processions, and perhaps an outdoor Easter Eve celebration of some sort, lighting the fire, you know. And this year we've had to do it all behind locked doors. And that in itself reminds us that the story begins, in a way, on Easter Day with the disciples behind locked doors. And Jesus is there, all of a sudden. He was among them. He was there. As if to say, well, what God did, what God does through me, is as real now as ever. No locked doors make any difference to it. So something of that perhaps we might be meditating on in this period.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about the things that we would typically be doing during Holy Week, and I know there are many people that are grieving the loss chiefly of the Eucharist.
Oh, yes.
And I'll ask you in a bit about perhaps changes in liturgy. But one thing that many clergy here, and I would presume clergy there in the United Kingdom are talking about, is the fact that there's a balance between word and sacrament, and we've gotten so focused on the sacramental side of things that this is actually giving us an opportunity during this time to refocus and recapture that sense of the love of the word.
That's an interesting perspective, I think. I'm always a bit cautious about putting too much of a gulf between word and sacrament, because, they are both essentially the same reality. They are God coming in action, in energy, into our midst, and binding us together and transforming us. So just two sides of the same coin. But if what this period does for us is, how should I put it, to drive us into a deeper level of communion with one another, communion around what God has to say to us and what God is doing with us, then it's itself a kind of sacramental reality. So when we gather, as we're doing now, online, communicate online, and have these strange digital relationships, get used to seeing our fellow congregation members popping up on corners of the screen, when that happens, even if we can't actually share the bread and the wine, we're affirming that we are brought together as a community of real flesh and blood people, however distanced from each other, brought together in, again, that act of God which can't be defeated. God holds us together, even in our digital distance. And discovering how deep that goes, and discovering how it's not destroyed by this crisis, that is itself a kind of sacramental gift, I'd say.
And it's certainly, you mentioned the digital way that we're staying connected with our congregations now. And, I've been wondering too about how this resurrection and rebirth of the church is going to look after this, because, quite obviously change happens. Change doesn't always happen quickly. And the church of 2020 doesn't look the same as the church of 1920, or even the church of May doesn't look the same as February. If you had to guess, and I know that's always a difficult thing to ask, but looking at the resurrection of the church at the far end of this, how do you think the church may come out of this in a new, perhaps broader or more expansive way? Keeping in mind, of course, the quote I love from Mary Shelley, that nothing is so painful to the human mind as change.
Yes. Well, two things come to mind. One, I think, is connected with what I've just been talking about. I think a lot of people have discovered a kind of appetite for more spiritual seriousness and depth. The parish I help in here in Cambridge now has a daily meditation going out to people, and daily intercessions, as well as the live-streamed Eucharist from the priest's house on Sunday. And people respond to these meditations, obviously use them. They use the prayers. We send out a little daily office for them as well. And I think there are going to be a lot of congregations where, after this is over, we'll find that the expectation, the appetite for going a bit deeper has really taken root. People will expect that level of nourishment, which suggests a lot of hard work for us clergy in the future, certainly. But the second thing is not unconnected with that, and that is when you have events happening online and congregations meeting online, it is also possible for some to, as it were, to slip in and out, to come and be part of this in a way that they don't feel is threatening. First time we did a live stream mass in the parish here, we had somebody from Japan just dropping in. And a couple of weeks later, we had somebody from Canada dropping in. Goodness knows how they got the connections, but they did. And I think that's another side of it. A number of churches have been advertising the times when these services are available, meditations or corporate acts of prayer are available, advertising them fairly widely. And people do, as I say, slip in. I think it's connected with the way in which a lot of people in the UK certainly prefer slipping into a cathedral on a Sunday morning if they happen to be in the city, rather than going to their local parish church. They want to find out what it's all about. They don't want to be instantly more committed than they feel, but they want to get a sense of what this strange world is that the church represents. And I think our digital communications are helping quite a bit with that in a way.
Yeah, one of the lines that a lot of clergy here in my diocese, and I'm sure around the country, have been sharing is, we're getting into your point about visitors from as far away as Japan. We're getting more people in the pews on Sunday mornings now and throughout the week than we did previously.
That's right.
You know, in looking at the makeup there, I have a friend that's a rector of a cure of 10 parishes in the Diocese of Salisbury. And, you know, here it's a challenge enough for a single parish to be connected. How do you think that cures in the Church of England or the Church of Wales, which is your home church, will adapt to reaching, you know, an even greater number of individual communities?
That's a very interesting question, because it does suggest, doesn't it, that it might be possible with these very scattered congregations to find slightly more imaginative and slightly more regular ways of keeping in touch than we've yet found. So instead of a single cleric tearing around in their car on a Sunday morning to cover several congregations, or instead of a very complicated round of services in different churches week by week, maybe there's more possibilities than we thought of regular digital communication. If a tiny parish like the one I help in Cambridge can produce a daily intercession sheet, a daily office, and a daily meditation, I should think that, you know, the possibilities are there for all sorts of communities to do that. Given that, as I say, perhaps the expectations are higher and the appetite is deeper now.
Yeah. One other thing that I know is under conversation here is what a resurrected liturgical life will look like at the end of this. We talked earlier about people grieving not having the Eucharist at the present time, and we were already underway with discussions about changing the Book of Common Prayer here in the Episcopal Church. I'm sure that will look dramatically different, but even on the more granular scale of liturgies, and particularly with the Eucharist, what deliberative changes or deliberative processes do you think will now have to be brought in to address some of these bigger questions we haven't had to look at before now?
I'm not sure I've got a very clear answer to that. In fact, I know I haven't got a very clear answer to that. But just thinking out loud for a moment, the first thing I'd really want to say is, of course, this shouldn't make us a less Eucharistic church. We are who we are as church at the Eucharist, when we're all together simply as the guests of the risen Jesus Christ, fed with his life, and the sheer earthiness, the incarnate quality of that. We mustn't lose our nerve or think again about that. That is really the heart of things. But I'm a great believer, being an Anglican, in the idea that you have some very firm convictions at the centre and some slightly flexible boundaries further out. That is, that if you know where the heart is of your church life, then you can think quite a lot about how to operate on the margins without anxiety. You don't have to go banging in the fence posts all the time. And so it makes me think a bit about how we might, as small Christian groups, think of those almost sacramental events where we simply gather, perhaps with some digital input, but gather in a group round a screen, maybe, connecting us with another group, where we share our reflections, and perhaps we all break bread together, quite literally, just informally, but in a way that echoes but doesn't try to replace the sacrament. I wonder if that's the direction we could go in, whether we could be thinking of what you might call paraliturgies that would evolve like that for people who weren't able to meet but wanted to be in some way intelligibly, prayerfully together and showing it in a real way. We've had here, as I'm sure you've had in the States, discussions about whether if somebody was live streaming a Eucharist from their home or even from a church building, groups could, as it were, put the bread and wine in front of the screen and do it for themselves at home. That's a point at which most of my available theological categories just go into the melting pot. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. What I do know, though, is that the willingness to connect and to connect in some sort of material, physical way is very strong. And for me, at least, the minimum we could do there is perhaps think about those very simple acts where, as it were, you and I connecting on the screen might just be silent together and then simply break bread together and share it as an affirmation of the deeper communion, the deeper Eucharistic communion we share. So I'm thinking out loud here, but those are some of the thoughts that come.
And it will be interesting. I know that, the Episcopal Church has a national convention coming up next year. Lambeth, I know, has been postponed, but I'm wondering now if perhaps this may be something that's addressed as part of the agenda whenever and in whatever form the communion of bishops gathers. So it will be interesting. But again, we were talking earlier about change. Change is not quick. And I know, and I'm grateful that my own bishops and bishops and liturgists throughout the Anglican Communion are very thoughtful about this. And, as much as congregations might like an immediate answer, there isn't one, but it will be done deliberatively. And I think that will be the greatest gift, is the conversation and theological reflection that comes out of this.
I think you're right. And I think, in a way, that points us right back to where we started. What matters here is not so much what we're doing and what we're sorting out, the solutions we come up with. The church, I like to say that the church is because God is, not the other way around. And God is always bringing the church into being. God is daily, hourly, bringing the church into being by calling people into the fellowship of Christ. And if you hold on to that deep prior sense that it's God's call that is echoing in all of this, maybe you have a little bit less anxiety of having to fix it all in the next 2 weeks, which is just as well, because you aren't going to be able to.
Well, I'd like to end, and I know you have a particular affinity for particularly Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. And so as a lead-in to my last question, there's a wonderful story by Tolstoy, A Coffee House in the City of Surat, which is about the interaction of different individuals from the Christian and the Brahmin and the Jewish faith gathering in this coffee house to reflect on the question of who is God. And a quote that I love, Tolstoy writes, "The more one tries to understand God, the closer one will come to him, reflecting God's goodness, mercy, and love to everyone." But in the midst of this, I think a question many are asking is, where is God, and why is God allowing this to happen? So for your final thoughts, at the intersection of that quote from Tolstoy about the trying to understand God and drawing closer with the question of where is God, what do you think people can understand about God in the midst of this pandemic and this time of physical separation from one another?
Yes. Yes, as so often for us in the more prosperous bits of the world, it's sobering to realize that we're experiencing just a bit of what the vast majority of the human race experience regularly in terms of fragility and pain and loss and separation. And I think it's important that we just hold that in mind before we get too apocalyptic about our own situation. This is terrible, but it's a terribleness that a lot of our fellow human beings live with, and which a lot of the time we don't actually notice very much. But coming to the question itself, you can address it, I think, at the very general level. God has made a world in which causes and effects work out. God doesn't spare us the effects of the things we have caused. And just as with environmental crisis, we are working through the effects of irresponsible behavior, so even with this pandemic, there are forms of human carelessness, human oversight that have, at the very least, made it easier for this to spread. And it's that kind of world. And although that's no comfort, living in that kind of world is also means that this is the kind of world where we can really learn and respond effectively, because it's a world of cause and effect. When we understand how things come about, we know better how to respond. And so the cycle goes on. We pay the price of mistakes. We then find how to see more clearly what behaviors, what habits, etc., make things worse. But all of that is still at a very kind of abstract, rather textbook, academic level. And I think I'd come back again to something I remember saying in 2001, when, as you probably know, I was actually in New York on 9/11 and stopped in the street the day after by someone I was wearing my clericals. And the person said, so where was God yesterday? And I could have embarked on a theology lecture. I thought that was probably not what they were asking. And said, well, perhaps you start by saying, God is in the skill, the courage, the risk-taking of the people who are trying to meet the suffering where it's worst. And if you say there's a problem of evil and suffering in the world, I'd say there's also a problem of good in the world. Now, the mystery is not just that there is suffering. The mystery is that there is skill and generosity, sacrifice and risk, that there are people who, it seems quite unself-consciously, go to the very heart of the problem, go to where the suffering is worst, and pour themselves out into it. And for most Christians, I guess, if they were asked, where do you see God? They might very well say, well, it's in lives like that, it's in moments like that. And people who say that would also no doubt say, I'm not sure how it all joins up as far as ideas and concepts go, but I do know that I've seen another world in operation, another system of values from the one that we normally think of, a system of values where risk, sacrifice, selflessness are actually the very grain of things, the very heart of things. And I think that's seeing God.
I think many people expect God to act in the way the Old Testament God did, with these dramatic appearances and burning bushes and voices coming out of the heavens. And I prefer to think of God to the point you were making about the individuals in our daily lives. I have always clung to the image of God as that moment of sheer silence passing through the cave in Kings.
Yes. Interesting. You should pick up an allusion from Jewish scripture there, because Jewish scripture is not just about the God who manifests in the great moments of storm and tempest and burning bushes. There's the still small voice there, but also one of my favorite passages in Genesis, where Jacob meets his brother Esau again, the brother that he's defrauded and disadvantaged and run away from. And Esau, it seems, welcomes him and forgives him. And Jacob says, to see you is like seeing the face of God. And I think that, that great moment of healing and reconciliation, again, that's where you see God.
What a wonderful place. And I always like to end on hope. So
Yes.
with that moment of hope, I'll thank you once again so much for making time for this conversation.
My privilege, thank you.
Sharing a bit of your insights. And I pray in the time ahead that you and your family, your students, and certainly the greater church come out of this with a renewed sense of resurrection and hope. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bless you. Thank you.
God bless you.